reaction. A couple of men very close to the situation. Congressman Chris Van Hollen, Democrat from Maryland. Congressman Rob Wittman, Republican from Virginia. Welcome, both of you.
It's good to be here.
Thanks for appreciate it. I want to talk in general about your feelings to what the president had to say last night. One of the things he said, though, is that there is bipartisan support for the actions, for taking this action that he outlined last night in his speech. But he also said, I welcome congressional support for this to show the world that we're serious about this. In your opinions, is that congressional support there for the administration? And Congressman Van Hollen, since you're closest to me, I'll start with you.
Well, I think there is. I mean, I'd have to talk to Rob and our colleagues, but I certainly think there's bipartisan support for going after ISIS in a targeted way. We're already doing that in Iraq, providing air support for the Iraqi forces and the Kurdish forces, which has helped stop the advance of ISIS. Bigger challenges in Syria. It is really important, in my view, that we coordinate this with our allies in the region. It's important that some of the Sunni-led governments, like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, be in the fight against ISIS. So ISIS can't claim to be the righteous carrier of Islam in the region. That's really important, and that's going to be a challenge.
Congressman Wittman, you're on the House Armed Services Committee. Do you feel that that support is there in Congress?
I do. I think the support is there. I do believe Congress has to act. I believe Congress needs to give its permission to the president to continue. I do believe that we want the specifics about this, the 4 objectives the president laid out last night and the strong action he speaks of, I think is absolutely necessary. We must destroy ISIS. Now it's down to the details. How do we work out those details? How do we, as Chris said, engage those partners in the region to make sure that this is a long-term abolition of extremist Islam? I mean, that's really what we have to be working on. I do think that there's agreement there that we have to wipe out and destroy ISIS. The key is now the details. How do we do that? How does Congress understand? How do these objectives then get put into place, and what are the resources necessary to accomplish that?
How do you see this playing out? Because when you talk about the resources, obviously there's going to be money involved in this, and Congress is going to have say in the money that's involved in this, whereas the White House says it also may just take action without the approval of Congress on certain things. After 10 years plus of dealing with this and dealing with situations in the Middle East, is this going to go along the same routes as what we've seen in the past, or might we do things differently this time?
Well, I think there needs to be congressional approval. I think there will be a back and forth about what does that involve. The president talked about no boots on the ground, but there are boots on the ground there. We're going to have advisors there, special operators there on the ground. So the question is what does that actually result in, and what resources do we need to put there? The airstrikes, the help to forces on the ground, engaging the Peshmerga, the Sunni forces there, and the Shia militias there. How do we integrate all that, as well as the forces on the ground in Syria that the president now talks about? So the question is how do we arm those friendly forces, and then how do we put together the airstrike element of that, and then how do we sustain that? So there are going to be questions about how much does that cost, and how do we sustain those operations?
Is there concern? I'll let you answer that question, but also is there a concern in Congress right now that this may? And granted, while, and I believe you put it quite well, there will be boots on the ground in some form or another, whether or not they're combat or not. Is there concern, though, in Congress, though, that this may go beyond what the president talked about last night, and this may go back to what we saw in the situation in Iraq years ago?
Well, sure, there is concern. That's why the president was very clear last night that this is not going to be another Iraq war. And the main distinguishing feature is this is not going to be new sort of sustained combat boots on the ground. You're going to have advisors. You're going to have people providing intelligence and surveillance. But the model is what's happening in Iraq right now, where those forces, U.S. forces on the ground, are really helping supply that intelligence to Kurdish forces, to the Iraqi forces with the air cover. I do think this is a big issue. I think Congress should act as right now. The president is saying he can act in Syria under the original 2000 AUMF that authorizes us to go after al-Qaeda. That's a very broad authority. So I think Congress, in saying that we support the ISIS mission, should also make clear that this is not an open-ended blank check. So I think we should act, and I think we should make it clear that we're not supporting an open-ended engagement that could become another Iraq war.
Speaking of checks, I'll stay with you on this one because you're the budget guy. Congress does have some work to do outside of what's happening in military action, and that is making sure the government stays funded. Is that the priority now that you're back in session?
That's absolutely a priority. I should say, with respect to money and the situation against ISIS, the really costly engagements are when you have lots of American combat forces on the ground. So hopefully we can share that burden with our partners in the region and keep those costs limited. Yes, Congress has to avoid another shameful 16-day government shutdown. We saw that last year from October 1st to October 16th. It cost our economy over $24 billion, created all sorts of unnecessary disruption. My goodness, I hope Congress can work to make sure that that doesn't happen again. That is a priority.
Can we do this on a bipartisan level?
I'm confident we can. I think people look at it and understand we have to get this job done. I want to make sure not only we get the job done now, but we have to look in the future, too, and make sure that Congress gets back to doing its job on what's called regular order, and that is adopting these appropriations bills on time so we don't get to these continuing resolutions as a way to fund the government. We've gotten closer to that this year, so there's progress to be made. But these continuing resolutions and these deadlines are not the way to make the best decisions. So I'm sure we'll get the CR done on time this year, get the government funded. But we should also not lose our resolve to make sure we get back to doing things the proper way in adopting these appropriations bills on time so we don't have to have these last-minute continuing resolutions.
It's important that people understand a continuing resolution is essentially putting last year's spending levels on an automatic pilot. And right now we're talking about a continuing resolution from the end of September through early December. I agree with Rob. We really need to do our work in making sure we're focused on funding the priorities, which change year to year, rather than just putting things on automatic pilot with a few adjustments.
Well, I think it's a safe bet to leave it on an agreement.
Yes.
With both of you guys right now. Listen, gentlemen, I appreciate it. We could talk for hours and hours and hours. I know you'll both be back soon. Look forward to seeing you.